Thanks a lot. The grandeur of Marx's Capital only becomes more obvious with time. I mean, there's a new biography of Marx that was published earlier this year by a historian called Jonathan Sperber. And in some ways it's quite a good book. It's very scholarly and is particularly good on the kind of German context in which Marx emerged and so on. But he has this really crass line that Marx is, in Capital, is fixated on early 19th century debates among economists, like in particular with respect to the economist David Ricardo, and all this is completely irrelevant to trying to understand the contemporary world. Now, I think this is complete nonsense, and demonstrably nonsense. And I want to give... Now it's sounding too well. Now I want to give two examples of why I think Marx's Capital has such an actuality, or you can see how in the process of writing it is a tremendous actuality. First of all, why did Marx start writing what eventually became Capital? Because in 1857 a major financial panic developed in the United States and then spread to the world economy, precipitating a global economic crisis. Does that sound at all familiar? Anything resembling contemporary events? So what Marx Marx had been planning to write a book on economics for a long time, but what drove him actually to write it was the crisis of 1857. And if you look at how his ideas develop in the course of writing Capital, one of the key questions that he's preoccupied is the interrelationship between one of the most important theories he advances in his book, the theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is sometimes dismissed by commentators, but which is, I think, a key element of his analysis. What he's interested in, though, is in the interaction between this long-term tendency for the rate of profit to fall and the tendency of financial markets to move between periods of euphoria, bubbles, and panics. And he sees the evolution of capitalism as in many ways driven by the interaction between the two. Now, I think that's an enormously contemporary idea. It's exactly that set of questions, the interrelationship between the long-term difficulties that capitalism has had with profitability since the late 1960s and the development of more and more deregulated and globally integrated financial markets. That interrelationship is crucial to making sense of what's happening to capitalism today. Secondly, one of the things that Marx is doing in Capital, I'll come to how much he writes and rewrites. He was an obsessive rewriter. But one of the things that he's trying to do is to widen the scope of the book in order to offer an analysis of capitalism as a global system. And even with Volume 1 of Capital, which was first published in 1867, and which was the only bit that he actually lived to publish, he then, particularly in the French edition, which he thought of as particularly important, because he and Engels, his great collaborator, saw France as the centre of any process of revolution in Europe. So that, it came out between 1873 and 1873 and 1875, so just after the Paris Commune. He was very interested in what impact the book would have in France. One of the things he does in the French edition is include much more material about what's happening at the level of global capitalism. Are people finding it hard to hear? Yeah, okay, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. But can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. Can we kill this bloody thing? Honestly. So that, and we find this, so that we find him, again, in the 1870s, he's getting more and more interested in America. He sees the way in which there's in process a shift in which America is going to supplant Britain as the centre of global capitalism, and therefore increasingly it's industry, finance, the development of agriculture in the United States that's going to be the test of the future development of capitalism as a global system. So he's got friends, comrades, Germans who emigrated to America after the Revolution of 1848, who he writes to saying, can you get me material so that I can better understand what's happening in the United States. This is a man who had a very profound understanding of capitalism as a global system, and he's trying to make sense of its evolution. It's like someone trying to understand capitalism today who recognizes how important China is to the future of capitalism, and so wants to discover what the hell is happening in China. Okay, now Capital is famously an unfinished work. You know, Marx died having only published the first volume in 1867. And this reflects the fact that that he conducts this enormous process of both research and self-clarification, and this produces a series of manuscripts. There's the so-called Grundrisse, the manuscript he wrote in 1857-58, which is sometimes seen as the first draft of Capital. Then there's the only other thing that he managed to publish, apart from Volume 1 of Capital, the contribution to a critique of political economy. Marx liked snappy titles, which appeared in 1859. Then there's an enormous manuscript, the 1861-63 manuscript, which was meant to be the continuation of a contribution to the critique of political economy, but which got completely out of control. I mean, it's spread across 5 volumes of his collected works. It includes his critical discussion of bourgeois economics, what he called theories of surplus value, all sorts of other stuff. Immensely rich, but as a kind of laboratory through which he's trying to clarify his concepts and develop new ones. Then there's the 1864-65 manuscript, which includes not simply a draft of Capital Volume 1, although we've lost the actual draft, but the materials from which Friedrich Engels, after Marx's death, edited the volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. Then there's Volume 1, which he finally publishes in 1867, but in many ways the French edition, which I've referred to, is a significant development of the original German version of Capital. And there are all sorts of other manuscripts that he's constantly working. So what we see is an intensive process of research and self-clarification that goes on for 20 years, from the late 1850s through to the late 1870s, the period immediately before Marx grows too ill to carry on working. Really, and that actually he really only stops working when his wife dies in 1881. So it's more than 20 years. It's an incredible process of research. One obvious question is why was Marx unable to finish Capital? And sometimes people kind of have this either intellectual or critique or kind of psychoanalysis, arguing that Marx didn't finish because he couldn't, he was confronted with too great difficulties and that kind of thing. This is nonsense. This man was incapable of finishing anything. There's a letter between 2 of his associates in the young Hegelian movement in the mid-1840s, where one of them, Arnold Ruger, says he's absolutely brilliant, but he can never finish anything. He always is revising, reading new books, and so on and so forth, which you can see in their correspondence. It's driving Engels mad. Engels is saying, come on, you've got to finish the bloody book. And Marx is going through all sorts of manoeuvres to avoid finishing. He won't let go. Essentially he's a theoretical and empirical perfectionist. Okay, so that's something preliminary about the whole process through which Marx wrote Capital. But what I'm talking about is his method. So I just want to emphasize, this isn't an introduction to Marx's Capital. There are other meetings that are going through the basics of Marxist economics. They're good books. For example, David Harvey's commentary on Marxist Capital that's are more introductory. Ben Fine and Alfredo Sarfio's book on Marxist Capital. This isn't what I'm doing here, so be warned. Hegel is going to come up and stuff like that. So, what is Marx's method? The first thing to say is that it's an empirical method. He's constantly trying to understand how capitalism works. So, when it comes to the Grundrisse, the first major manuscript, which he starts in response to the crisis of 1857, he's famously, in the course of writing it, he comes across a copy of Hegel's work, The Science of Logic, which had belonged to the founder of the guy who went on to found anarchism, Mikhail Bakunin, so another revolutionary. He gets hold of Bakunin's copy of The Science of Logic. It illustrates a bit what a small world the revolutionary movement was in Marx's day, and he says it was very helpful rereading Hegel's Science of Logic. So there he is, engaging in serious conceptual work, but at the same time he's trying to develop an empirical picture of what's happening. So he takes notes on the development of the crisis that amounts to a 500-page book. So there are these two parallel things he's doing. And he writes to Engels, who's based in Manchester, saying, keep the hub of industrial capitalism at the time. He writes to Engels and he says, if you hear any good gossip in the stock exchange, please pass it on to me. And Engels sends him copies of The Guardian, which was, of course, then produced in Manchester, but says, unfortunately, it's gone off, it's not as good as it used to be. So moaning about The Guardian is a very traditional activity of revolutionaries. So Marx's method is empirical, but it's not empiricist. What's the difference? Empiricism is the idea that you can develop an analysis of the world simply through observation, simply through looking at what's happening and generalizing from what's happening. Marx is tremendously interested in looking at what's happening in the capitalist system, but he doesn't think you can just naively look at the world and understand what's happening. Partly for reasons I'm going to come on to, but because Marx was a product of the German classical idealist tradition, starting with Kant and culminating in Hegel, which insists that we always see the world structured through the concepts that we have when observing the world, and those concepts, the kind of presuppositions that we have before we make any particular observation, shape how we understand the world. That means that if we want to get a proper understanding of things, we have to have critically to interrogate the concepts that we use. This is why Marx's books tend to be titled or subtitled Critique of Political Economy. Political economy is the name of economics in Marx's day. So it's essential to criticize the categories through which capitalism is currently understood in order to deepen and arrive at a real understanding of capitalism. And there's a famous, very early text, which in the English translation of the Grundrisse is published as its introduction, generally known as the 1857 introduction, where Marx sets out his method, and he describes it as rising from the abstract to the concrete. And he says this is the scientifically correct method. Now, what is he saying there? Partly, he's just saying what I just said, that you can't understand the world just by looking at it. You have to have the right set of concepts to understand what's happening. But he's saying something deeper than that. And there are two things I particularly emphasize. First of all, he's saying capitalism is a totality. It's an interrelated set of elements. We're encouraged to see capitalism as, just the consequence of individuals' activities and so on. To have a fragmented view of capitalism, partly for reasons I'll come on to in a minute. But capitalism can only properly be understood if we see that it's a totality, where all its elements are integrated, driven by a certain unifying logic. And to do that, Marx says, we can't start by looking at how capitalism developed historically. We don't start with the kind of origins of capitalism in, I don't know, the Florentine banking system in the late Middle Ages or something like that. We have to look at the system as is fully formed, and that will, and we can only even understand the earlier phases in capitalist development, the way in which it's formed, once we have a clear understanding of the logic of the whole system. So, to put it in a slogan that is sometimes used in discussions of Marx's method, the method for understanding capitalism is logical, not historical. In other words, we look at how the different elements interrelate in terms not of how they initially came into existence, but in terms of how they fit together in the workings of the system. Let me give an example of that. In the development of capitalism, how does capitalism develop? It develops around merchants, so in trade, and gradually those merchants become bankers. So capitalism starts in trade and then spills over increasingly into finance. And there are lots of historical studies of the development of capitalism which look at early merchant capitalism and early finance and so on. They're very interesting and so on. But they don't tell us about the logic of capitalism as a fully developed system, because capitalism as a fully developed system involves the domination of production. And to understand capitalist domination of production means seeing finance and commerce, retail as we call it now, as subordinate parts of a totality that transcends them. The key of the story is in production. Okay, even though capitalist domination of production comes relatively late in the story. So the priority of the logical over the historical. A second crucial reason why Marx has this idea that we have to move from the abstract to the concrete is because how capitalism appears it to us, how it presents itself to us, is systematically misleading. Marx draws the analogy with the formation of modern physics. You know, it looks as if the sun goes around the earth. The starting point for modern physics is when people like Galileo say, sorry, we can't trust the appearances, we have rather to go beneath the surface and develop a set of critical concepts that will allow us to understand how the solar system operates, and also to understand why it appears as if the sun goes round the earth. Now, Marx's reason for distrusting how capitalism appears itself to us isn't just this general scientific point, it's also because of the work of what he calls fetishism. This is one of his key themes in Capital, the fetishism of the commodity. What does this mean? Capitalism is a system where the bulk of what's produced takes the form of commodities that are bought and sold on the market. Commodities exchange on the market. And what this means, Marx argues, is that we tend to see what are really social relations as relations between things. We tend to see the market relationships that bind people together as the starting point for any analysis, rather than looking at the process of exploitation, procreation and so on, that produces them and makes them possible. And that leads to, it's a long word, but it's become fairly unavoidable, that leads to a naturalization of economic relationships under capitalism. In other words, because it looks like our lives are governed by the relationships between objects that are produced on the market, we tend to see the capitalist system as natural, as like the movement of physical bodies in the universe, and so on and so forth. And what does it mean to say that capitalism is natural? It means that it's always been there and you can't change it. one of the great themes of Marx's critique of political economy is to attack the political economists for treating capitalism as natural, for seeing it as somehow corresponding to human nature rather than historically formed. But nevertheless, capitalism works to encourage us to see itself as natural, and that goes with a kind of general, we experience the society as fragmented, as not fitting together into a coherent whole. And therefore, that means we have systematically to distrust the appearances and to seek to go beneath the surface to understand the underlying structures. And to do that, we need, as Marx says in the preface to Capital Volume 1, we need the power of abstraction. Now, let me try and bring this out more clearly, we'll see if I manage it, by looking at the structure of Capital itself. I would say if you look across the 3 volumes of Capital, what it's describing, what it analyses, is a process of externalization. Now, I just want to leave that, I've said that, it's another long word, I'm just going to leave it hanging and try and bring out what I mean by that. If you look at the 3 volumes of Capital, Volume 1 is about production, Volume 2 is about circulation. So Volume 1, the production of commodities, the creation of value, the extraction of surplus value from workers, that's what Capital Volume 1 is all about, and the accumulation of capital that is made possible by the exploitation of workers. Volume 2 is about the circulation of capital. Because what capitalist firms produce are commodities that have to be sold on the market, how commodities exchange on the market and whether capitalists actually get back the money that they invest through the circulation of their products is very important to understand. That's what Volume 2 is about. It's the most boring bit of Capital, but if you're really obsessive like me, you have to work your way through it. And then there's Volume 3, and Volume 3 is about the unity of production and circulation. The subtitle Marx gave, which Engels changed, I think mistakenly, was he calls it, Volume 3, configurations of the total process. In other words, once we understand capitalism as a totality involving both production and circulation, we see that these very specific economic forms that emerge that in many ways are quite hard to understand and to relate to the rest of the totality, but it's very important to do so. Marx takes from David Ricardo the labour theory of value. In other words, the idea that commodities exchange according to the socially necessary labour time required to produce them. I'm not going to go into the details of that theory because there are other sessions at Marxism that deal with that. This theory is crucial to the understanding of capitalism as a whole. First of all, because you can't understand capitalist production, the core of the system, unless you have the labour theory of value. Because the labour theory of value allows you to understand what Marx sometimes calls the secret of capitalism, which is the fact that it all rests on the pumping of surplus value out of workers, the exploitation of workers in production. The labour theory of value is important for another reason, which isn't sufficiently emphasised, but is really important, which is that unlike bourgeois economists, Marx is able to use the labour theory of value to explain why a capitalist economy based on the exchange of commodities is necessarily a money economy. That a commodity economy can only work once you get one commodity, historically things like gold, that becomes, as Marx calls it, the equivalent, the universal equivalent. It's a commodity that can represent the value of all other commodities. And the consequences of that insight, the fact that a capitalist economy is a money economy, works its way through all the levels of analysis in Marx's Capital. But, Marx says in Volume 3, the thread of the inner connection of capitalist production gets lost the closer we move to the surface. What does he mean by that? Once we move, if we have the right tools to understand the capitalist process of production, it's pretty clear what's going on. And Marx shows this very dramatically in Volume 1 of Capital. Once we move beyond production and look at circulation, and in particular the unity of circulation in the third volume of Capital, it becomes much clearer, much less clear. Why? One reason is because surplus value is created in production through the exploitation of workers. But then, once we move to the level of circulation, surplus value gets redistributed within the capitalist class. So you have the productive capitalists who actually run the process of production. They get their cut, what Marx calls the profit of enterprise. But there are lots of other capitalists who are interested in the whole process. They're the commercial capitalists who sell the products. Today, these are some of the biggest capitalists in the world, capitalist retail firms and so on. They don't create surplus value. Things aren't produced in retail, they're circulated, but they need their share of the profit, so there's commercial profit. Then, let's not forget financial capitalists, the bankers and so on and so forth. We know bankers do absolutely nothing for free, so they need their cut, which initially takes the form of interest on loans that are raised in financial markets. But finally, there's another condition of production, to use bourgeois language, which is land, and they're the capitalists who own land and increasingly these days speculate in land. They need their cut too, in the shape of rent. These are all fragments of surplus value. So Volume 3 is about a fragmentation of the total surplus value as it's distributed among different sectors of the capitalist class. And of course, because, as Marx says, they're a band of hostile brothers, they're constantly fighting with each other over their shares of the loot. And the form this fighting takes is competition. And Marx says everything becomes reversed in competition. In other words, it looks as if in competition, the commercial capitalist or the banker or the landowner are in some way creating value themselves, that they're making a productive role in the whole process. And this obscures the actual reality of exploitation, which is at the core of the system. And part of the greatness of capital is that the way in which Marx shows that these distorting appearances, this is the process of externalization that I was talking about, the way in which the inner connection of value creation and exploitation gets lost when we look at capitalism as a whole. But part of the genius of capital is Marx shows that it's necessary that this happens. You know, commodities that are produced have to be circulated. It makes more sense for some capitalists to specialize in it. It also makes sense to have some, from a capitalist point of view, to have some capitalists specializing in money markets. Inevitably, private property in land is going to mean that there are other people, through their pure ownership of land, claim a share of the surplus value. All this is, so the fragmentation of surplus value is necessary to the functioning of the system, but it makes it harder for the workings of the system to be understood. And therefore, abstraction is necessary to get beneath this misleading surface, to understand the inner connection. But then, and this is the genius of the whole enterprise, Marx doesn't simply stop at the abstractions that he formulates at the beginning of Capital Volume 1, which famously the chapter 1 on the commodity is really difficult, because that's where he's setting out, in some ways not a very helpful way, the basic structure of the labour theory of value. But Marx doesn't stop there, but moves to show how what he calls the law of value, the requirement that commodities circulate according to the socially necessary labour time required to produce them, governs the operation of the whole system. And this means that, rising from the abstract to the concrete means that Marx is, through Capital, is progressively introducing more complex categories. The very beginning, he starts with the commodity, then money, then he presents this mystery. In capitalism, money grows, it expands. They get out more money than they put in. How is that possible? He introduces the concept of labour power. That then allows him to explain how workers are exploited. Then you get a whole flood of distinctions: constant and variable capital, relative and absolute surplus value, the accumulation of capital that allows him the wage, different forms of wages and so on, that allow him to build up a picture of how the process of exploitation goes on. But he doesn't stop there. The movement from abstract to concrete moves through volume 2 in his study of the circulation of capital, and then in volume 3 he introduces profit, which is surplus value compared not just to the value of labour power, the worker's wage, putting it crudely, but to the total capital that the capitalist invests. You get him showing that competition means that commodities don't exchange at their values but at their prices of production, which are formed as a result of competition, and on and on and on, into financial markets. He nearly gets lost in financial markets. It's the part 5 of volume 3 is the most, in some ways, the most difficult bit of Capital as a whole. It's very interesting, but what Engels found was a mess, part of which Marx just called confusion, and it's a bit unclear who exactly was confused there. But it's very important because he's looking in detail at the logic of what we now call financial markets, and so on. So this process of moving from the abstract to the concrete. This is where I'm going to mention Hegel. As I said, Marx says he found Hegel's logic very useful in writing the Grundrisse, and we can see Hegelian motifs and categories appearing constantly through the various drafts, including Capital itself. This is because Hegel provided a critique not just of empiricism, starting from the appearances, but also what one might call formalism. In other words, having abstract concepts, but not being unable to connect those concepts with the way in which the system appears. This is the great fault of Ricardo, Marx argues. He has the labour theory of value stated very rigorously, but he can't connect effectively the labour theory of value with the concrete workings of capitalism. Hegel helps Marx to think through and resolve this problem in ways I don't have time to discuss. But what Marx does is cannibalize Hegel. There are people who try to prove that the structure of capital reflects the structure of Hegel's logic. I think this is completely wrong. What Marx does is to take bits of Hegel's theory and use them for his own purposes, to think through a more profound understanding of how the system works. Final point I want to make is this. Once you get started about Hegel and abstraction and all that kind of thing, externalization, it can be intimidating. You may feel Capital is this very sort of dry, austere work. That's not true. It's a tremendously passionate work. If you haven't read the first volume of Capital, please sometime find the time to do it, because it's a really great work. Not simply does it have this very powerful intellectual architecture, but it's full of anger at the suffering that workers experience under capitalism. And this is most famously in the chapter on the working day, where Marx reveals the sheer lust for extra profit that capitalists have, and the suffering that they inflict on workers, and all, incidentally, all this stuff about the precarity, all that sort of thing. Marx knew about the real phenomena that are inaccurately described through such categories, the existence of complicated labour markets, some workers in much more marginal positions than others, and so on. He analyses that very well in volume 1 of Capital, and it's informed by tremendous anger at the suffering of workers. And you find this even in the drafts and so on. Suddenly he'll be describing, how agricultural workers were driven off the land in 18th century England, and he'll interpolate the swine. He's so angry at what the capitalists are doing. But he's not, this isn't a book by a social worker. Sorry, no offence to, I'm sure, the many social workers here. Sorry, yes, I get into trouble. He's not doing it just because I'm going to stop. He cares about the people who are being so brutally treated by the capitalists. He's not writing it out of just sympathy with the oppressed and exploited. He's writing it from a political standpoint of identification of the working class as not just the object of capitalist exploitation, but precisely as a result of that exploitation, the potential subject of history, of revolution. And that's why it's such a great work.
Yeah, I'm a natural scientist, I'm a biologist, and I'm really glad that Alex has talked about the kind of scientific character of capital, because sometimes you hear from mainstream economists, a lot of the kind of academics and things, is that Marx is essentially just an idea, Marxism just like an ideology, and it's not scientific. And actually one of the things that really appealed to me as a biologist and got me really interested in Marxism was the fact that it's got such a scientific character, and one that I don't really see in mainstream economics. So one thing that we are really keen on it in biology is distinguishing between what we call phenomenology, which is just looking at the surface appearance of things, and instead trying to find underlying mechanisms. And one of the problems I have with mainstream economics is the way that you get kind of such a superficial sense of what drives capitalism by just looking at the kind of surface events without ever getting to the real motive, the driving principles. So, one example of this is what's that famous book, Galbraith, about the 30s crash. It's a great kind of account, very kind of racy about how the thing happened, but there's no sense at all in the underlying kind of factors that led to crisis. So I think that's one thing that I really value about the Marxist approach. The second thing I wanted to say was about the way in which Marxist method has influenced Marxists who want to try and explain other aspects of the world, the natural world, which obviously appeals to me because I'm a natural scientist, and in particular I'm thinking about the work that Lev Vygotsky did after the Russian Revolution, because what happened after the Russian Revolution was that there was a huge kind of flowering of ideas about how we could use Marxism to try and understand the world around us. And one thing Vygotsky said was, he looked at Marx's method in Capital, and he said it's like he's got this unit of analysis, it's identified, the labour theory of value, and he uses that to kind of understand the whole system in the way that Alex has been talking about. I guess kind of like as a prism in which you can go from the concrete to the huge capitalism as a whole, and then right down to the individual workers' relations in the factory, that kind of thing. I don't fully understand it because I'm not an economist, I'm a biologist, but that kind of sense. And what I found really useful about the way that Vygotsky used it was then to identify his own unit of value, which he saw as language and thought kind of merged together, because he sees language as kind of critical to the way that thought is kind of formed in the human. But also then that link with activity that allowed him to make some quite revolutionary steps forward in understanding how the mind works. Unfortunately, because he was killed essentially because of the way that Stalinism smashed all this kind of flowering of intellect, he was never able to take it to its fuller level. But it seems to me there's such a possibility of using this dialectical Marxist method in other ways that even the natural sciences, where the reductionism has been an incredibly valuable tool to understand the natural world, we still lack massive areas like how the brain works, how embryos develop, in which I think this method could be really important.
It is, yes.
I've never got past volume 1, I'm afraid, but nevertheless that in itself is quite remarkable. But I wanted to ask Alex a couple of questions, really.
Okay.
When I was first a shop steward, which is actually a considerable period of time ago, even before Thatcher, I worked in a manufacturing company, and whenever we were involved in bargaining over wages, they would always complain to us, say, well, look how little profit we're making. We could make more money putting it in the bank. Now, at the time, this is before I'd read volume 1, I might add, I always used to think, well, why don't you just do that then? And actually it's quite an interesting question, because if all the manufacturers did that, how much money would they actually be making? And that's the question which Marx addresses, I suppose, is that actually you don't make any money then because no one's making anything. But the question is that they didn't put all their money in the bank. They did still carry on making tin cans, as it was, actually. So I'm wondering how much they're aware of that reality and how they resolve this struggle between those various branches of capital. Because I think it's good that you mentioned this issue about precariousness and the novelty of it, or otherwise. Actually, I was rereading a bit of Capital a couple of weeks ago, and Marx talks about one of the problems which was highlighted in a commission of inquiry in Britain. This was bakers. Some of the bakers were complaining that some of their competitors would make people work for 18 hours, but only pay for 12, which is exactly the phenomenon you could find in contract cleaning today, in fact. But of course, they were complaining, saying, well, they're not playing by the rules. So are the rules there to regulate the lack of control of capital itself? Is it a regulatory mechanism? Are there conscious regulatory mechanisms in capitalism to try and resolve the conflict between those who actually don't seem to have any concern whether or not they are paying people enough to reproduce themselves? I mean, that's to say they don't care whether there's a future labour market, their own labour supply. How does that come about, and does Marx address this in the volumes that I haven't been able to read yet?
Yes, the world has changed quite a lot since 1883, and I wanted to talk about the way in which some of the things Alex has mentioned can be used, the method of capital, to try and develop that tradition. Because one of the things we've tried to do in the Socialist Workers' Party and the IS tradition is try and keep pace with a changing capitalist world. And I think there are three ways in which we've applied quite rigorously the Marxist method. The first is when Alex talks about a process of introducing more concrete determinants. This is a process that continues today, and if you read Alex's book on imperialism, that's one recent attempt to try and integrate the kind of things Marx is saying with the complexities of the state system, of geopolitical competition, and saying how do you integrate in these much more complicated, complex, concrete phenomena. The second thing that I think has been tremendously important in our tradition is the notion of competition. If you read the writings of people like Tony Cliff on state capitalism in Russia, there's an extraordinary sensitivity to the way that inter-imperialist competition forces upon the Soviet Union a model of appropriation of labour, oppression of the working class, and so on, which mirrors conditions in the West. The competition takes place in this case through imperialist rivalry and weapons production and military competition and so on. Nonetheless, that process of competition forces capital to behave in capital in the way that, very much in the way that Marx describes. The third element that I think has been tremendously important is drawing together a rigorous value theory with an empirical, a sensitivity to the empirical development of capitalism. I'll give you one example. When I was working with the late Chris Harman, and when he was writing Zombie Capitalism, one of his frustrations was when he looked at people writing in political economy, they either produced very detailed empirical studies of the system, or they discussed value theory. And what he was trying to do was draw the two together. One very concrete form that takes is when Harman used to talk about falling rate of profit, he was very conscious that the trend within academic Marxism was to draw up these series of simultaneous equations which actually prove, if you look at them, that actually the rate of profit can't fall, or it's indeterminate, it goes up and it goes down. The point Harman always used to make was you invest at one point in the system, you generate your profits at another point in the system. You can't simply construct a series of equations, you have to look at how the system develops as an empirical system in time. And when you look at it in that way, you can begin to explore some of the trends that lead the system into crisis. So the project that I think Alex describes very well that Marx undertook is a project that collectively we have to embrace the method and try and develop the theory today.
I just wanted to say something about the historical context of capital. This is something that's not often said anymore. I can't understand for the life of me why this is, but Marx was talking about, it was a critique of political economy, yeah. What do we mean by that? What kind of economics is that? Well, it's classical economics, isn't it? You read any book in the history of economic theory, and it either ends with Mill or Marx himself, because that's the end of classical economics, right? After that, it's all neoclassical, which culminates in neoliberalism, which we've now got, which is based on a different theory of value entirely. It's based on a specious theory of value known as marginal value theory, which is just a way of counting. It's not a way of accounting for value at all. Whereas Marx is talking about something real, which is based on something which, in classical economics, is absolutely crucial that we have to get our head around this, because Marx's theory of classes is based on this as well, or rather, what he inherits as his theory of classes is based on this, because it's based on the factors of production. It's based on land, labour, and capital. So the three classes are the owners of land, the owners of capital, and those who only own their labour, can only do anything in the world by selling their labour. Now, if we don't get our head around that in the first instance, we don't even get off the start. Now, I don't disagree with anything Alex is saying, by the way, because there's absolutely, there's hours and days and weeks and years to talk about what's in capital. But I just think that those are points worth making because they're not made enough. Now, one of the reasons I want to make that point is because Marx is very clear on the difference between the tension between the capitalist and the landowner. Now that disappeared after the end of the classical period because what happened was they airbrushed out the whole distinction between value that just comes from natural resources and the value which is accumulated from labour applied to natural resources and other tools and capital, which is capital itself. This is a distinction which is airbrushed out and completely disappeared out of theory. But what I'm trying to say is, you cannot understand what Marx is doing if you don't, keep coming back to that. I'd like to have a conclusion for this. I think. It doesn't matter.
Thanks to Alex for a very clear exposition. I want to raise a question which is about the unfinished nature of capital work, because it is an amazing work and a constantly frustrating work at the same time, it seems to me, when you read it. When you get to volume 3, as Alex was explaining, you can no longer talk simply in terms of value and surplus value. You have to talk in terms of profit that goes to capitalists. That profit secondly has to be divided into the profit that goes to the industrial capitalists who fight over it and the commercial capitalists, like the retailers and so on. Then also the section that goes to finance in the form of interest and all the other types of way that financial capitalists collect a slice of surplus. Then also the landlords come in with their claims in terms of rent and so on, and there's something missing still, which Marx doesn't talk about at all, and that is tax. Because there's another agency that steps in to the whole circulation process of capital and says, I want my slice, and it's called tax. It's the state or the states. And the state hardly appears in capital. And yet, obviously, in the century since, and more since Marx died, the role of the state in the running of the capitalist economy has grown. The question of the other forms of competition, other than economic competition, military competition, and so on, have become increasingly important, even in the very definition of capitalism. We can't understand Soviet Russia as state capitalist unless we understand the role of military competition. The state does appear in places, most notably, I think, in the famous chapter, and probably a very good place to try and dip into Marx is to read the chapter on the working day, where the state steps in because the capitalist class is threatening actually to destroy the working class by it constantly pressurizes it, putting pressure on the working day, and the factory inspectors are brought in, where he doesn't explain how they come to be invented, but they are brought in, and eventually, and they're forced, in a sense, to act to contain capital and limit its exploitation to a degree. So there's a problem about the further extension of capital. Somebody once said, I can't remember, it might even have been me. I'm sorry, I can't remember. But the problem, if you want really to understand capital, you have to try and finish it. And this is a real question. And so I just want to end with a further question for Alex, which is, in a sense, what are the ultimate limits of what we should understand capital as a work to be, if it were to be finished? Because there's something else missing from it, analytically, which is the class struggle. Should we actually start to develop the categories further to bring in the class struggle, the struggle of workers over wages, over conditions, over the control of the system, and so on and so on. Anyway, questions. Thanks.
If I could start to ask people to keep their contributions to 2 minutes, then we'll be able to fit in, I think, most of the people that have indicated, because there's quite a few people that want to speak. So is that all right? Thank you.
Yeah, I want to encourage the reading of Capital, and I think people are obviously very intimidated by it. They think actually it's only something for eggheads, and I think every time you come to a meeting like this, you actually think it's only something for men, because actually it's only ever men that get up and speak on it. And I want to encourage people to read Capital, and I think somebody gave me a brilliant tip when I started reading Capital Volume 1. It's actually you start at the back. You start at the bit that Alex talked about, the descriptions of the working class, in all its brutality and its horrors of early capitalism, and the passion of it, and the anger of Marx. And he's very insulted in his description when he attacks the class. It pulls you in. It absolutely pulls you into it. And he quotes a headline in the Times newspaper, in which there was a headline at the time which said, "A seamstress who died of overwork," and she was making a wedding dress for one of the princess of the day, and she was working 23 hours a day, and it killed her, and he absolutely you can imagine, he's so angry about this. And I had just read Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, and I had just read about a Filipino woman who was slogging it out as a seamstress, and she was making clothes for Gap and all the other companies, and she had just died of overwork. And I was reading it in the 1990s, and it was the same description, more or less, from Marx in Capital. I tell you, from that moment on, I wanted to go back to page 1 and understand it. It wasn't the easiest thing, but I had the bit between my teeth. And if you start from the back, you will get the bit between your teeth, and you need to, because in order to change the world, Marx is so important, because that's how we change it, by understanding what makes it tick.
That was a very good talk, Alex. It was very educational for me. I sort of came to Marx quite late in life, and for me, Karl Marx was a caricature, because I remember watching Wolfie Smith, and he was the powers of the people and that kind of thing. And so Marx didn't really have any relevance to me on the shop floor, because I used to be a machinist. I used to pay my subs every week, but there was no connection between politics and work, just based on that pay bargain. We didn't see the political angle to it. So I became really conscious during the miners' strike. But one thing about Marx is, the great thing about Marx for me was, like Alex said, his passion. Because most academics, I used to read when I started to get education, reading books about economics, it was very dry, and they talked about human beings and flesh and blood as if we were just like some kind of puppets moving on a chessboard or something, not people with families and relationships and stuff. But I remember when I read Marx, I thought, geez, this makes sense of the world for me at last. And then what sort of really blew my mind was when I read this thing from Marx, and one of the things he wrote, he said, I was trying to work out, why is it some people are doing well in life and other people are not, how come I've been stuck in this crappy job? I didn't know anything about all this world, how the world works. I think Marx says something about, and how capitalism, what it does, it individualises things and makes you blame yourself, and self-blame and guilt as if you're responsible for your poverty, etc., etc. But then Marx made this great statement saying that it's not social consciousness that determines being, but rather social being that determines consciousness. And that just just fantastic, because it made sense of everything for me then. I realised that if you are born in a capitalist state, in a crappy capitalist state, and you go to a crappy school, you get crappy teachers, and you're told you're crap, and then you leave school, of course you're going to have that consciousness that, that's how it is. But I'll crack up, last point. I often thought about Marx being like a crack mirror of capitalism or the capitalist system. As like a crack mirror, it shows the world like kind of fragmented and distorted. And then what Marx did was restore the mirror, so you saw it as it really was, complete picture.
Okay, when I sat down and read Capitalism in the British Library, I wrote out large parts of the book onto my notepad. And I tried to make sense of Marx's theories as I copied them out. And like many people, I found that the theory is complex and often difficult to understand. But when I came to the section on the conditions of the workers in the Manchester cotton mills of the Victorian period, I found something I could relate to, because I, as a teenager, had to work in one of these mills, Vale Mill in Oldham, as a lowly porter, the bottom rung of the ladder. And what struck me was how little things have changed in over 100 years. The mills are still dirty, there were grim places with long hours, bad pay, and rotten food to eat in the canteen. If I hadn't already been a socialist, this experience would have made me one anyway. So years later, as I read Marx, I realised that there really was a sound explanation of how these terrible places came to exist and how to form a society which makes them a thing of the past. And if you don't think that it's necessary, just look at the conditions and what happened to those poor people in Bangladesh a few months ago when their factory collapsed and hundreds of them killed. I mean, we want a society where that sort of thing doesn't exist anymore. And one of the ways you're going to get that is by reading Capital, because it's a really great book.
Hi, I have a rather quiet voice, and if I can't be heard, get me to shout. As a title, I think it's fantastic, Capital. It doesn't say much more, and you can't really over-explain, because that is the problem. That is such a huge problem, and I'm kind of like looking forward to my introduction to volume 1 and 3 and 2, whatever, because I'm looking forward to it very much, due to the fact that I've lived in terror for too long. Because for me, whenever you're encountered with a problem, and don't ever kid yourself that capital, as a class, capitalists, they are powerful, they kill, they destroy. And because I'm a result of all that, as Alex would put it, all the confusion, the dirt that floats up to fragment and divide us as agents to our self-liberation. Because it's once you leave that depth, that abstraction to go towards the concrete, what you do is you're stuck. You're stuck because you imbued with fear, because you keep thinking you're on your own, you're separated, you're isolated. But the solution, that's why capital itself is fantastic, and I got this from Alex in my darkest hours. He said, the solution is always there in the problem itself. Marx says that. It is only the people who suffer under capitalism can find that solution and that freedom, that overcoming of it. It's called revolution. And I'm going to finish by basically saying that to some extent, I'm waiting for the architectural beauty of the abstraction to help me to counterbalance that terror. And the other weight to that terror, the balance to that, is of course uniting and being together and talking and finding ways and being in solidarity. And I just want to say to Alex that the SWP is doing a fantastic job. I'm enjoying this experience immensely, and I know I'm a late starter, and I have no embarrassment about that, because I think I'm going to stay here hang around for a long time. But I'm just saying that I think it's not just the beginning. Work has already started a long time ago, and work will always continue. We'll have victories, we have defeats, but it's part of us being humans, being thinkers and emotional people, being real, and this is how we fight them.
This next one will be our last speaker. Sorry to all the people that have indicated. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay, I just want a quick point and a question for Alex. I've recently gone back to academia after a long gap, and it's industrial sociology and stuff like that. And one of the thing that you really miss, what Marx does in Capital, because of what Alex described in terms of moving from the abstract to the concrete, the idea that he looks at capitalism and he's able to relate what's going on the surface to deeper driving forces within and dynamics within. That's what you get. You get a dynamic, you get a sense of what's driving the system, which you don't get in this kind of stuff I have to read in my academic life. So you're supposed to be reading about the world of work and social relations at work and what goes on, and then you turn the page and they say, here's a diagram. And you've got I dread boxes with arrows between them, because it couldn't be more superficial. It's flat, and they might be things that are joined together, but there's no sense of what's driving what. The game I usually play to test how bad it is I try imagining moving the boxes round and changing the positions and see if it actually makes any difference. No, it doesn't, because it's just stuff that is vaguely joined without that sense of dynamic. And it is really difficult. I mean, God knows how Marx did it, but trying to understand the dynamic driving forces beneath the surface appearance is a very difficult thing to do. The question, though, is about that in Marx. You talked, Alex, about how Marx talks about moving from the abstract to the concrete, and you mentioned his comment that as he moves closer to the surface, some of the inner realities are lost, become less clear as move to the surface. Now, but you also said that capitalism disguises itself in the surface appearance of relations between things disguises the inner reality of social relations between people. But doesn't it go further than that? I could get slaughtered for this. It seems to me, when Hegel talks about the appearance, he talks about essence and appearance, and he specifically says the essence, the appearance. It's not a ghost-like thing. It's not an illusion. The appearance is real. And it seems to me that when Marx says he moves towards the surface, he moves towards the concrete. The surface is concrete. The surface is the inner social relations are real, but the surface appearance of relations between commodities is also real, and that's why it looks like it, because it actually is like that. So when commodity markets crash, then it has real impact on the social lives of human beings. So I just wonder if maybe you'd finesse that a little bit more. It's not that it looks like that, it really is like that. The social relations of the capitalism really are.
Okay, thanks. Lots of good points. First of all, I agree with Maddie in encouraging people to read Capital, and I agree with her totally that reading and writing about capital or talking about capital shouldn't be a guy's game. Fortunately, there are an increasing number of women who are contributing to the study of capital, and much may this continue. In terms of how to start with capital, because Marx does make it difficult with this very, lots of people trip up on the first chapter because it's so difficult, and he had lots of problems with it. He wrote it one way in the first. He wrote it one way. Engels, when he looked at the proof, said this is incomprehensible. So Marx wrote an appendix, which was even more hard to understand, and he completely rewrote it in the second edition and so on. So he found it difficult too. But there's a letter to someone where he says, if you don't know about economics, start with part 8, the final part of volume 1 on the so-called primitive accumulation of capital, which describes the process of dispossession and so on, through which capitalism forms itself as a system. Start with that, and then move on to the harder bits at the front. So Marx appreciated the problem. I agree that the historical context, or the intellectual context in which Marx wrote Capital, was classical political economy. People like, I mentioned Ricardo, but also Adam Smith. And Marx sees these thinkers as vastly superior to what he calls vulgar political economy. And vulgar political economy is actually the beginnings of what we now know and hate as the neoclassical orthodoxy. And vulgar economy, he says, is characterized by just starting from the appearances and systematizing them. And this is what takes place in a much more extreme way in neoclassical economics. We have markets which are kind of inherent in human nature, and we're all consumers, and we want stuff, and we've got money, so we try and, we're confronted with prices, and we try and work out, the best way to achieve our ends and so on. This is almost a caricature of starting from the appearances in the way in which Marx attacks vulgar economy. So he didn't confront fully formed neoclassical economics, which really starts with the so-called marginalist revolution in the 1870s, but he got the number of really what was involved in that. Now, in terms of the questions, I'll start with Simon's. No, you're absolutely right. Marx is a pupil of Hegel, and Hegel has this distinction between, it's translated in different ways, shine, illusory appearance, stuff that is just means nothing, and what he calls the forms of appearance, Erscheinungsform. And Marx and forms of appearance have a reality of their own. When Lenin read Hegel's logic, he writes a marginal comment, what we get from Hegel is the objectivity of appearance. In other words, the way things appear is part of the things themselves. Now that's very abstract, but what it means like that is that the things like financial markets have a kind of duality, that they reflect the fragmentation of surplus value. It looks as if people just make money through manipulating money. That's what if you read articles about the financial markets, they talk about value creation. What they mean is it's just manipulating the markets to end up with more money than you had to start with. That's how things appear. So it's an appearance, and it's a misleading appearance, because you don't get the extraction of surplus value, etc., etc. But they are part of the functioning of the system. Financial markets are real. They have huge consequences of our lives and so on. So, no, that point's absolutely right. That then leads us to the question about why don't capitalists just put their money in the bank? Well, Marx says that at the limit, that can be what happens. That the crisis, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is a continuous tendency under capitalism, but it can reach a point where you'll make more money if you put your money in the bank. But that is a symptom of the crisis of the system, because since the source of the interest is surplus value, if surplus value compared to the capital invested is shrinking, then the system is going to get into deeper problems. And one of the things that happens with financial markets is that you get these waves of euphoria where it does seem that you can make profits just through manipulating market transactions, and the illusion develops that this process can continue to indefinitely. And one aspect of crisis is it's where the real process of value creation that takes place in production asserts itself on the financial markets, and then dragged back into line with the underlying realities of the system. And this is one aspect of what happened with the recent financial crisis. Regulation and competition. Colin partly dealt with this. Yes, what Marx thinks happens in his article, in his chapter on the working day, what he's saying, among other things, is that the competition among capitalists leads them to increase the exploitation of workers by lengthening the working day. That threatens the viability of capitalism, because if you kill off all the workers, then that's it. It's like the capitalist who Marx describes moving to, I can't remember where it was, Tasmania, with a retinue of workers and so on and so forth. They don't die out, but because land is freely accessible, they just bugger off. And the poor guy, Mr. Peel, discovers there's no one even to make his breakfast anymore. So if you get, capitalism can't function without labour to exploit. The problem is, for any individual capitalist, if they shorten the working day, then they undermine their competitive position versus their rivals. And therefore, that's why the state is important. The state comes in to impose a limit to the working day that is in the interests of capital collectively. But the real twist in the argument is, why does the state come to that? In part because of massive organisation by the working class movement, also bourgeois and Tory philanthropists, but crucially the development of a working class movement that demands a 10-hour day, that demands a restriction in the length of the working day. So you have class struggle, you have a kind of micro model or example of what happens with reforms under capitalism. Workers, through their organisation, screw concessions from the capitalists that can, in a certain context, help to make the system more stable. Incidentally, I think this example shows that the class struggle is there in capital. This takes me to Colin's question about the unfinished nature of capital. One of the complexities that commentators argue about all the time is that early on, in the late 1850s, Marx announces a plan where he's going to write 6 books. Capital, let me get this right, landed property, wage labour, the state, the world market, and crises. I think, I'm not sure I've got that exactly right, but that's effectively right. So, which is interesting because it shows he sees the whole work culminating in crises and so on. Now, what happens is, and there's lots of argument, did he stick to that plan or did he abandon it? Because, of course, the only thing he published was the first volume of Capital. And what happens is, I think, that more and more Marx realises that he can't deal with showing the functioning of capital without incorporating elements from the books that he planned to write later. So he integrates wage labour and landed property into the argument of capital, and partly for that reason, and partly just because he's ill and doesn't have time and isn't going to finish even Capital, he abandons the later books, but he draws in lots of elements of them at different points in the work. And in some ways, one of the finest things he ever wrote is in the last part of Capital Volume 1, and it's a chapter which is a rather intimidating name, which is the genesis of the industrial capitalist. But what he describes is the whole process of formation of capital historically, including slavery, including the wars between the different European powers, the development of the credit system, and there's a lot of discussion of the state and how not just individual states, but the competitive interaction between rival states is critical to the formation of modern capitalism. So Marx, I think it's an overstatement to say that the state isn't there in Capital. Marx never writes the book on the state, let alone the two books that were supposed to come after it on foreign trade and world market and crises. No, but he does draw elements in. The final point I want to make is about finishing Capital and so on. How to finish Capital? Well, I think there are 2 answers to that point. First of all, the whole enterprise of Marxism since the 3rd volume of Capital was published in the 1890s has been about finishing Capital, either in the sense of covering things that Marx didn't fully cover. So Hilferding, in his book Finance Capital, focuses on financial markets in a systematic way that Marx didn't do, or updating his analysis to capture new trends and new, as he would put it, configurations of capital as capitalism evolves historically, and Joseph referred to that a bit. How did Marx think that Capital would finish? Well, he told Engels in a letter, it will finish with the class struggle and the breakup of the existing state of affairs.